Hi there, and welcome to Be a Global Citizen, the podcast that explores the concept of global citizenship through the lens of value-creating education. My name is Scott Bauer, and I'm a Soka researcher and educator. I hope you find the discussions, stories, and insights on this podcast to be valuable and inspiring as we strive to become global citizens who are committed to living a contributive life. Enjoy the conversation.
Hello, this is Ryan Allen. I'm an associate professor of international and comparative education and leadership at Soka University of America.
Hi, Ryan. So good to have you on the podcast. Thank you so much. We have been in communication for well over a year at this point.
Right.
And I kind of gave you this heads up that I really wanted you on my podcast. You were enthusiastic and said, let's do it. And then life happens. And now here we are. I'm so glad that we're able to hold this space and to really spotlight your experiences and also your thoughts about this topic, global citizenship. I know that you, like from our conversations, you have lived around the world in different countries, across the states as well, and your interests are very explicitly looking at the kind of international scale. Through this comparative lens, really understanding what's happening in your immediate surroundings as well as what's happening far away. So I feel like that really bodes well with kind of the topic and trying to gain a deeper understanding of like what do we mean here. And yeah, you teach at the graduate school level. I think that's amazing. You get to connect with so many amazing students who are also very interested in this topic. So yeah, I find that it's going to be an amazing conversation and like we've always had. And then yeah, let's just get right into it. So the first question really is to kind of understand a little bit more about your background. So if you can share a few of the milestones that you've kind of gone through and kind of what led you to the current work that you're doing right now.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Scott. We have been talking about this for a while, but one of the things that I think is funny as an adult or as you get older, it's like time is very fast. So it's like, oh, it was just a year ago. It doesn't seem that long. Whereas like if you're a kid, it's like, wow, that was a whole year ago. Where just things are, you see your friends like every 3 months. And it's like, oh, you see some other, but that was 6 months ago. Oh, it's not too long ago. I just saw him. So yeah, it's kind of funny how our sense of time really changes and elongates as we get older. So thanks for having me on. A couple milestones. I guess I'm originally from Oklahoma in kind of a rural, exurb, suburban type of environment that I don't think was too worldly, or at least not in maybe the sense that we kind of understand. Although military bases and things like that were a big part of it. That's why my family even ended up there in the first place. But I think I went to college just locally. I wasn't very academically focused as a kid. I just kind of went to the nearest directional U, as we call it, so University of Central Oklahoma. Kind of floundered around, enjoyed college a lot. I mean, I really loved my undergraduate days. I was a public relations major, actually, although I tried to change it last year, and they're like, well, you'd need to do another 2 years. So I decided I'll just keep this major and graduate on time. And one of the things I did there that I think kind of changed trajectory was going to study abroad in Italy. And I really kind of grew up there in a way of just like thinking about the world and like being on my own and being away from home. And so that kind of really inspired me. When I graduated, I was thinking about, can I go abroad? What can I do? Kind of looking around. And I didn't immediately go abroad. I actually went and did a leadership consultant stint at my fraternity's headquarters in Indianapolis. And so I got to travel around the United States, going to different campuses, which was amazing to see the country, see different universities, and kind of help different chapters either, get off the ground, or if they did something stupid like 18, 19-year-old boys consistently do when they get together. And so I did that for a year. The financial crisis hit. Technically, I was laid off, although this is a job you only do for a year or so anyway, and ended up going to South Korea to teach English, and just, by myself went and didn't really know much about South Korea, didn't know much about where I was going. And when I got there, I mean, it was just like a stunning experience. And that really sort of changed my life teaching abroad there. Eventually, I loved it so much. I stayed for a master's degree. And so I was doing a master's degree in international relations. And then I thought I would stay in Asia for a long time or live there, semi long term. I was looking at going to Hong Kong, actually. I really liked Hong Kong. And then my girlfriend at the time went to the United States to study. And I was like, okay, are we going to continue this or whatever? So I was like, all right, I'll apply to grad schools back in the United States. So I chased her back to the United States, ended up in Teachers College, Columbia University. I did another master's there and then matriculated into the PhD program, where I did my PhD on, my doctoral research was on Chinese universities and how rankings impacted their sort of faculty, students, and staff. And then after my PhD, I got a job in Chapman University, which is in Southern California, and basically managing and teaching in a joint doctoral program with Shanghai Normal University. So we'd bring students who were lecturers in universities around Shanghai, private universities, and then they would come to the US for a year, get their PhD or, do their PhD classes, go back, do their work. And we were sort of supposed to be kind of going back and forth between China and the United States and that kind of stuff. Unfortunately, in the middle of that, COVID hit. And so we were doing everything via Zoom, and it was a big pain. Although I did that for 4 years, graduated my students, although we had another class come in who just graduated, but I only kind of stayed with them for a year before switching over to Soka University, where I'm currently teaching, as you mentioned, in the grad program. And I mean, I recently got tenure, so that's great, and really looking for this is my long-term kind of home. So yeah, excited to be here.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Ryan. And congratulations. I didn't know that about the tenure track. That's huge. So well
Yeah,
done.
thank you.
Well done. Well deserved and well done. And thank you so much. I learned so much more about you. I didn't know about like various things like that you're from Oklahoma and that you studied abroad in Italy. I know you went to South Korea. And so
Right.
yeah, we did have that conversation. The fraternity thing too was pretty awesome. And yeah, I think you've been in so many different like educational spaces, not just in higher ed, but also with your teaching in South Korea. And were those like high schoolers, or what age group was that?
So yeah, my first year there, I was teaching at a public high school, and it was tough because they come to my class and it's sort of the screw around class. It's like, hey, the foreigner. I wasn't really giving grades or anything. It was just like they wanted practice and exposure. I was working through a Korean government program called EPIC, and but it was great, And some students didn't care. They just wanted rest, and I understand because this pressure on Korean adolescents is grueling and what they have to do. But some of them really took advantage and would come. I had like a lunch program where they would come during lunch, and someone get like this experience. And I sent some of my students to the best universities in South Korea. One of my students who was super shy would barely talk, although his English was very good because he grew up partially in New Zealand. When he came back, he had like, different color hair, and he told me that he won a speech contest, and he's like a different person. But from the first day he showed up in my class, when he just like wouldn't say a word, even though he understood and had like perfect vocabulary, it was almost like I was just teaching him confidence. And so that kind of thing felt really good.
Well, I mean, just hearing you talk about your former students, I could just see your face light up, and then the smile as well. It's clear that, even though you were, from what it sounds like, thrust into a classroom, and perhaps you were maybe like a little unsure as far as like how this would go, what would be expected of you as a teacher, right? Do I have to grade? Do I have to kind of like, how do I do classroom management? But it sounds like the kind of like life to life, like just like in front of the student, really caring for them, sounds like you really were able to like excel in that as you were building your knowledge as a teacher.
I mean, yeah, I think I was interested in the students and their trajectory, and I was excited to be there. You're right in that I didn't really know what to expect. In fact, when I showed up, I was supposed to go to a different city, and I was supposed to be in a different school. And then suddenly they switched it, and some of my friends were in like a kindergarten, and there, it was really hard to do interaction there. And they called it like, oh, you're just a tape recorder, where the teacher would like point to you, and you would say the word, and then that's basically it. And for high school, I mean, I was in control of the class, the curriculum, really everything. And so it's just very different wild card type of experience. Granted, my job was harder than some of my friends, but I personally got a lot out of it, especially in my own career trajectory afterwards.
Yeah, definitely. And so, finding yourself in a totally different culture, and also in the profession of teaching, I would imagine that it was challenging at times. I find that being a teacher, you're very like introspective and highly self-conscious of like, is what I'm doing correct? Or maybe this is just me kind of projecting, but thinking like, am I just emotionally scarring these children? Am I doing the right thing? And so, I think being in that role, the experience is very heightened. But I also think that like, you didn't spend all of your time in the classroom. You were also just soaking up the culture, and you had traveled a little bit, right? You mentioned Italy, but actually moving to another country is quite different. I'm just curious, was there a particular experience in South Korea that is very memorable in terms of like how you experienced culture shock, right? How you were able to kind of uh, recognize like, some of these differences, and kind of how that landed in that moment of your life?
I mean, I remember when I first arrived, I think I got there like a week early, and I had a friend through the fraternity who was in Korea. He was a Korean American, but he just happened to be there at the time. And this was the time before smartphones when I was there. And so, like, I think now traveling is a lot easier in a way, which is, I think it's a good thing because you can just sort of show up anywhere and your phone can get you around. But back in the day, even just like, 15 years ago, you would fly somewhere and it was like 50-50 if you were going to make it to your hotel or wherever you were going to go, printed out literally MapQuest directions in half Korean, half,
Right.
English.
West.
Remember those, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, I mean, there was just like so much like excitement and anticipation. And I just remember, eventually I made it to the hotel because I think I was going to go I think I went like a week before our actually like orientation was for the teaching. So I was going to meet my friend, he's going to show me around a little bit, but obviously he's not like picking me up at the airport. I'm taking the public transportation into the city. That's the kind of stuff that I, did a little bit in Italy, but you go back to Oklahoma and you don't use public transportation. You don't do that kind of thing. So it's like even just those basic aspects of living were like kind of exciting, but a little bit overwhelming. And I just remember one of the things that was most memorable is like I met him either the next night or one of the nights, and he took me into like, we take the subway from my hotel over to like the cool, like, trendy bar district, district, whatever. I just remember coming out of the subway and like, the subway stop and like seeing all these lights and just, all the life and the high buildings. And I was like, this is like, I feel like I'm in a movie. And I felt like I was like suddenly in Blade Runner, which is a movie I loved as a kid and grew up. And I know it's a little stereotype. It's like, oh, like, the Asian country is Blade Runner, but like it's just such a mystical experience for me that I can still remember this to this day of like that place, that stop, and how it was just like an assault, but in a good way on my senses, just everything, the sounds, the sights, the people. And I was like intoxicating. I sort of fell in love with it. And then a few years later, it's just like normalized. Like I moved when I went to Yonsei. I literally lived in that neighborhood. And so it just was like every day for me now. Eventually, I moved to New York and it's like subway, whatever, I don't care. And it's like, it is funny in some ways that you think about like, wow, like one experience that I still remember is something that I probably did hundreds and hundreds of times again, but it was that one time that really just kind of stuck out.
Yeah, no, that thank you so much for sharing. And I just resonate so much with what you were talking about with the kind of like heightened like awe of seeing all the lights up, right, in big city and not knowing what to expect. But you know, one other thing that I think is really important is you mentioned about like, but this was before we had cell phones and like I don't know, Google Maps and just the sheer terror. You didn't use the word terror, but the sheer terror of going from like one point A to point B could, you know, quite literally take you double or triple the time because you might get lost.
Hmm.
And I'm sure you experienced that. I did definitely getting lost all the time in like South America. And asking people for help on the streets and just getting further confused because I couldn't understand what they were saying. And they would just point. But like I find that, you know, and maybe you can like speak to this a little bit, but like, do you think there's something to say about the like getting lost and not knowing what to expect maybe contributed to some of those like memories or the sense of like where you ended up? Like, do you think that was in any way like important for you? Or if you were to like do it over again with Google Maps, you would have had less stress in your life or things would have turned out better? I don't know. It's kind of a weird question, but
No,
I'm curious
I
to
get
know
it. No,
about
no,
that.
no. I get it, and I totally agree. And it's funny, like you mentioned, like you had to stop and ask for some help, and it's like, does this person speak English? Or is this a danger? Do they think I'm a danger to them? Like what? Like how do you approach that? And I just remember like I've been in a lot of situations like that, whether it's studying abroad in Italy, which I have a story I'll tell you in a second, or you know in South Korea, and it's just like the people that you meet that you'll never see again, and that they probably only helped you for 15 seconds and just pointed you in the right direction. It's like, okay, I got to this place because that person like stopped, cared enough, listened, and sent me in the right way. And so I always try to take that into consideration. Like, I mean, it doesn't happen in like suburban Southern California, although if I see a lost, freshman on campus or something, but it used to happen in New York all the time, and I would stop and, give people help if I could, things like that. But the story I think that you're kind of getting at is there's a growth in that getting lost or like things going bad and overcoming it. And so, for instance, when I was studying abroad in Italy, you travel across the continent, really, people are going all over. And I was on a trip in Spain and I went to Barcelona and I think I had like a late flight. I forget exactly what happened because you can just like randomly pick up flights and it's like no problem. It's like you're hopping on a bus. And so I think I went a day early thinking like, oh, I can just, go to the hotel and get it a day early. It's no problem. And so I show up, go to get to my hotel, and they're like, oh, well, we're sold out. I was like, oh, really? Like, that's okay. And I was like, well, do you know any other? Like, yeah, you just have to go somewhere else. I was like, okay. So like walking around and like I can't. Every hotel is booked. I guess there it was some kind of event happening, and I'm not even thinking. If I'm sure it was a Saturday or Friday. I don't know, but it's just like there was no place that was open. And then I'm kind of panicking because it's getting late and it's getting dark, and I'm like, I don't know what to do, where I can go. I'm even like going into like really fancy hotels and being like, can I just, I had like my parents' credit card or something. I was like, I guess I could use this if as an emergency. And even they were booked and like, no, you can't. And so like I go to the police station and this is like, it's like dark, it's getting late. And like, I'm like, I don't really know what to do. Here's a situation. They're probably like, oh, this dumb American, backpacker or whatever thought I was. And they're like, well, you can go sleep in the train station. And I was like, and they spoke, one person spoke English, and I was like, is that safe? And they were like, just watch your bags. And I was like, oh no. So, but of course, I had literally no other choice, or I didn't know what to do. I think in this day and age, I would have dropped my bags off at the hotel because they said they could take my bags and then just like, I don't know, go to the club or something. I was like 21. So like I could have just stayed up all night or whatever, but I wasn't thinking. I didn't have that experience. So instead I went to the train station and it was frightening. I mean, you're just at the train station overnight. I was by myself and, I'm like, am I going to actually sleep? And I remember like seeing like a group of like guys who were like, looked like me, sort of, just young kids or, like 20-year-olds or whatever. And they were kind of hanging out, having a good time. And I just started talking to them for whatever reason, and I was telling them the situation. They're like, "Oh, well, we're kind of in a similar situation. We're catching like a night bus back to Poland. They were all Polish, and it was going to leave at like 5 a.m. or something, or it's 5:30, whatever. We're super early, so they couldn't really get a hotel room, so they were all sleeping there. And like, what do you want to come, just like hang out with us? Like, we're all just going to be here together, like, go to sleep, and just like hanging out with them. They were from Krakow, and just like they protected me just to be there with some people. And it was just when they left, I left and went up and went to a coffee shop or whatever else. And I'll never forget that experience of like these just group of guys were like, yeah, you're alone. We have other people. So that was just such a, I was 20, 21, and learning from that, like nothing was scary in Asia after that, to be honest. So
No, that's a great story. Thank you. The Polish guys helping out the American in Italy. It makes total sense. But it's something that like you wouldn't have, when you first decided that you wanted to go to Italy, you probably didn't anticipate something like that, that kind of scenario playing out. Well, oh, what if I didn't get my hotel room in time, and would I, yeah, these very real concerns about your safety, right, in a very new place. I think that's kind of a that's something that I've experienced, and I've heard from many other people going to study abroad, especially it being their first time. There's this sense that like, what's out there and who's out there, and can I trust them? And you're leaving your kind of your comfort zone, right? The safety net. And I find that when you get the sense that you are on your own, you have to make these judgment calls, right? Like, do I uh, where do I find this hotel room? Like, how expensive is it going to be? Can I afford that? Oh, there's no availabilities. What do I do next? And then like it's just like this kind of like one thing after another, but that ultimately you have to be the one to make that decision. And I feel like that ties into what you shared before, that going to study abroad in Italy was tremendous, like maturing on your part, right? You felt like you grew up a lot from that experience, and then of course that informs everything moving forward. um, and I think this sense of being at ease, wherever you are, and knowing that you ultimately have to kind of like advance. You have to kind of, you got to do something, right? You can't just, I mean, I guess you could just stand there, and that would be a decision. But I mean, realistically speaking, like you had a very clear objective of like, I want to find a safe place before I can actually kind of unpack everything. Um, but it's wonderful. Like you're kind of painting this picture of Italy for us, like as you're kind of searching for where to find a place, and the train station. It turns out, also New York, right? Public transport, like subways going everywhere. South Korea, flashing lights, big city, all of that. We tend to think of these places, those three included, as very exciting destinations, right? Those would be very much the three main places. I'm sure that would be on like a top 10 list for every young person right now that they want to go to. And then you contrast that with where you're from, which is Oklahoma, which I don't know if it would make the top 10 list. What would it be?
definitely
Like
not.
maybe the
Definitely
top
not.
top
Maybe
top
maybe
20.
if you're a fan of like tornadoes, or like extreme weather, people do go there for that. If you saw Twisters, that was filmed 10 minutes from where I grew up, or my parents literally drove by it. Some of the filming locations, like, oh, hey, there's Twisters filming right there. But yeah, I mean, I think that's maybe one of the reasons why I was, because all those places, you're right, are very, very different from where I'm from. So I think in part of that, it was like, oh, where I'm from is this place that is some boring to me, I guess, in a way, and I want to go out and see what's there. So that's definitely true, and kind of part of it. Now, I don't want to denigrate where I'm from. I think it was still like a wonderful place to grow up, even with all its faults. And my parents just kind of trying to give me the best life. But there are things like you leave, and then you realize, hey, there's things that could be better here, and some things that you might not know. Like I discovered things about Oklahoma that I never knew. So, for instance, we used to have in Oklahoma like this streetcar that used to run, public transportation that would bring people from, all the way down to Norman, up through Oklahoma City into like Edmond and there and other routes and things like that. And those are places in Oklahoma. If you're from Oklahoma, you're probably like, wow, yeah, this guy really is from Oklahoma.
Yeah,
Everyone else is like,
shout out to those who are
yeah,
listening from
yeah,
Oklahoma.
right. Everyone else is like, I have no frame of reference. But the point being is like, no, we never talked about any of this stuff of this, like, hey, Oklahoma had like aspects of urbanism. It was just, no, this is what Oklahoma is and this is what it looks like. And, if you want to live in a city, you're going to have to go somewhere else. And that's, I think, an unfortunate message that maybe, I don't think it's happening as much anymore, because one of the parts of the great part of the story is that, I left, but some of my friends stayed, and they're there making the city better. And Oklahoma City itself, I mean, not everywhere, is actually getting aspects of urbanism. There's sort of downtown life. There's a streetcar there now. There's like a sense of building up this city. One of my friends works for the city and helped get these bikes installed everywhere, like these sort of city bikes are like in New York, but it's the same kind of thing in Oklahoma City, and some bike lanes and things like that. So every time I go back, I'm just like stunned that like, wow, like this place is really growing up. And so it's exciting to see, even though, yes, you're right, it's not on the top 10 travel list. And I tell people like, hey, there's other places to go visit, but it's a decent place to live, and it's a lot cheaper if you want housing, I guess, in Oklahoma.
Yeah, no, thank you. I brought up this comparison between Oklahoma and the top 10 travel destination list, not to denigrate it, because I have been to
Yeah,
Oklahoma, and
sure.
wonderful people there, and people from Oklahoma like yourself, and I think, I guess what I was trying to kind of get at, is that it's the place doesn't stay the same as you were getting to, right? Like, people have stayed and like they've really developed the city, but ultimately it's your hometown, right? That doesn't change. And when you do go back, you kind of take notice of some of these changes, like the bike lanes, or you take notice of how it's kind of more buildings, or diverse populations maybe coming in, or different demographics, and all of that. But I've experienced this, having been around the world myself, lived abroad in Brazil. I, initially, before going, I always thought, like, Torrance, I'm from Torrance in Southern California. I was like, there's not much happening here. Like, I wouldn't go into the city like LA, and I just kind of, just maybe go to the beach. And because I would see it all the time, it was very familiar. And I just thought, well, that's just my hometown. It's not very exciting. And then you go uh, outside and you realize there's a much bigger world. And I think because I stayed away for a long time, then when I decided to come back, there was like a newfound appreciation that I was able to have with my hometown. And not to say that, like, because it's expanded or grown in this or that way. Actually, in a lot of ways, Torrance hasn't really grown or developed at the same rate, I would say, as maybe Oklahoma City, and different kind of timelines. But is there anything that you can say about this notion of like seeing your hometown through new eyes, but on like a personal level, right? Not from there's more bike lanes or there's this kind of infrastructure built up, but how you think about it, how you
Sure.
relate to it, from also in terms of the community and the people, like your family.
Right. Right. Yeah. I mean, one of the things you said, like, it's always my hometown, which is, it's true. But then it's like that phrase, like, you can never go home again. And that's also true, because every time I go back, I mean, just even the structures might be different, but just like the people and the relationships are a little bit different. Like, I always have in my mind, like, oh, we're going to go back and everyone's going to get together and it's going to be like this and we're going to do that. And it never quite kind of works out that way, because everyone else, in your own mind, especially when you leave for a long time, or even when you go to a foreign country, everyone else's life is progressing too. They're not frozen in amber in your hometown, even if your family, they're retired. Everyone has something, time progresses for them. And so there is some of that where I'm like, okay, there's a little bit of a nostalgia for a place that doesn't exist anymore, even though I can appreciate the experience of growing up there. And especially, I think, when I was in New York and coming from a background that, the high school wasn't very good. I'm from a more rural type of area. Going to college wasn't a priority. In fact, our principal was like mad if we'd go on college visits because he thought people were just skipping class. And it's like, no, some of us actually want to go visit colleges. And so juxtaposing that kind of experience with being in New York and going to Columbia and being with people who are from, like Choate and these like famous high schools and Stuyvesant, whatever else, like high schools that people probably heard of, and from very wealthy elite backgrounds, and that is a bubble. It really is. There's like a bubble in that environment, and a lot, just the nature of specific jobs and academia and media, and it's usually from people that are from those backgrounds and they grew up in those backgrounds. It's just the nature of what it is. So I always appreciated like, oh, I have this perspective that is, not as it's just different than what a lot of these other folks who are in in these spaces, more elite type spaces, if you will, that they don't really have and they can't really understand. And one of the things, I give you an example. So I used to have an accent. If you're listening, you're probably like, this guy's got to be from California, or he's like non-regional. You can't hear my Oklahoma accent, right? Or Scott, what do you think? Do you hear any twang at all, or no?
No, no, no. I would say, yeah, I would consider you just like a Californian.
Or yeah. So, but I used to have like, a vocabulary. I would say y'all and ain't and fixin', and I would have like
Mhm.
kind of a little twang. And when I go back, I hear it all with my friends and even family, my sister for sure. But when I was kind of growing up, I would hear like the critiques of this kind of accent, or make fun. I hear get made fun of. I not really me make fun of, but like hearing society make fun of this kind of dumb Southern accent and this kind of thing, and I jettisoned all these terms from my vocabulary and kind of focused on. I guess when you go abroad too and you're teaching, you kind of talk slower and you focus on diction and this kind of thing. But over time, I shed that accent, and I don't have it anymore, and it sounds forced if I use it. And then like that to me, that made sense as I left that space and going into those other spaces. But now I kind of I can see, I can have more appreciation for it. Like I'm kind of sad that I lost it, and I'm kind of sad that I did have that thought, because there isn't anything wrong with that kind of accent. It's just a different kind of accent. But I internalized it when I was growing up, and that's just the way it is. But I can appreciate it now. And when I hear it and see it, I try not to, think, oh, that person must be a dumb Southern redneck or whatever, because that's like my people, that's like where I grew up. So I try to think about that in those regards.
Yeah, this notion that through language, through one's dialect, right, the way that they sound, it ties so closely with identity. I'm sorry, right, for you to think that like back then the way you spoke and the accent was kind of like less favorable, because I mean there's larger societal forces at play in terms of like what's mainstream and what's kind of perceived in this way or that way. But to then be able to like look back on that accent and feel that, I don't know, you didn't frame it in this way, but almost as if like a part of you may have been missing or may have been kind of removed in some way, and that, but like to still hear it and appreciate it, like you're saying, I think is also really, it's like an homage, right? Of like, wow, of like a past, time when, you used to live there, or the fact that you're still connected even through this kind of like recognizing and like honoring that accent, because yeah, I mean, it was a part of you. It's still kind of, within your family and when you go back to visit with friends as well. But yeah, I find that to be very important. When I was abroad for a long time, I would come back, and I think there's something about the language learning process, like acquiring a new language and kind of the different tones that you use. But I remember. Oh yeah, and then also as a teacher, you articulate and all the
Right.
diction and everything you
Yeah.
said.
Yeah.
But I would come back and not use the same kind of slang and just speak with, I don't know, more of like this kind of like polished language that I'm trying
Hmm.
to like be very precise. And people would point out like, hey, cool accent. And I would be at home, like, not at home, but like I would be, in Torrance, and I would just be shocked that like, wow, like
Right.
you like what are you thinking? And what do I like? What does that even mean? Like, it's hard for me to kind of be really like critical of like how I sound because I'm just, I mean, I'm not like, analyzing
Did
how I speak.
was was that like so I one of the things I was thinking about was that did you feel like the reverse culture shock then? Because that's the
Exactly.
one thing that people talk about a lot.
Yeah, because then it's that kind of you're included or you're excluded. Like suddenly, I was back at home thinking like, okay, I'm with my people, and now my people are kind of pointing out, hey, where are you from? And then there's a little bit of that, yeah, reverse culture shock, like you said. But I mean, I think that just kind of gets to like kind of the insecurities that come with just navigating society and how we're perceived.
Hmm.
And I think this perception is really important, especially kind of now entering into this, notion of like global citizenship. There's a certain like sensitivity. People talk about it like one's cultural sensitivity and ability to kind of like navigate these different spaces, whether it be in your hometown or abroad. But it sounds like you've gotten a lot of training. It sounds like, I mean, training is one way of putting it, but exposure is another to just kind of understand how people in different contexts and from different backgrounds perceive you and how you respond to that. And so I know that you work with a lot of international students at Soka University, and you've worked international. I mean, you've worked abroad as well as an international teacher. But I'm curious, like how, like in the capacity of like being a professor or being a high school teacher, like what is it like to be able to like interact with students who are trying to figure out their own sense of identity? And does that kind of tie into like a deeper philosophy that you carry with you about what does it mean to foster a global citizen?
Hmm. Yeah, I think for me, it's because I had that journey myself from coming from what I just told you in Oklahoma to somebody that is now unfazed by walking in those lights and, public transport or, can kind of move in between worlds in a way, but it didn't just happen kind of overnight. We just talked about my journey. So I really appreciate being there for the people going through that journey. Like I can see it themselves. It's like they're going through it. They're growing up, and it's not always easy, and it doesn't always just like, I can tell them something, and it doesn't mean they're gonna just take it in and soak it in. It might take a while. It might the next year. Oh, that thing that Professor Allen told me. Oh, okay, I get it now. It might be a few years later. Still might not kind of get it. So I think for me, it's like just trying to be an empathetic teacher. And mostly is like bringing empathy in the classroom of students are coming from very different spaces and different cultural expectations, whether that's global culture, like something that's like, oh, a Chinese person in my classroom, or it's a class issue, a person who went to like a high school like mine that didn't focus on those things, or worse, they could be in my classroom and have just as much kind of misunderstanding about all these things that we're talking about as somebody from a different culture who went to an international school in that country. And so just trying to think like there's an empathy that I need to bring to each one of my students because this is part of their journey. It's like school is this fun thing that I love and I'm kind of always a part of now, but for the most part this is just like propelling students on their journey and they're not quite there yet. And so that's kind of my framework when I enter really any classroom or when I'm advising any student and just being cognizant of that, of everyone is somewhere on their journey. Some are further along, some are just beginning, even if they're in the same class.
Yeah, definitely. And it can be really complex too, trying to understand and keep track of where one student's coming from, and then kind of checking yourself in terms of how do you, yeah, muster up. I don't know if it's even called mustering up empathy, but knowing that you have to be somewhat stable and anchored yourself to really be there to listen and to build that kind of trust with students.
Sure.
And
Yeah,
yeah,
because teachers, as you know, you were a teacher, like we're humans, we get annoyed, we do things wrong sometimes, we make false assumptions and regret whatever. Like we're humans because those are all human characteristics. So if I can have empathy with my students or try, at least that's the goal, then hopefully they can also have that with me, although it might come later. We've all had, I think, like in course evaluations, maybe not at Soka, but definitely at my other university, I had some that were like pretty tough. And I'm just thinking like, all right, I can't be mad at these students. Like they are, and I was teaching undergrads a little bit then too, and that's where some of those points came out. And with the undergrads in particular, I was like, okay, this is like their first year. They're being challenged in ways like they've never been challenged before. And if I see some of those students who I know kind of didn't have the best time in a couple of my classes, then I could probably imagine 4 years from now, 5 years, 10, they'll have more appreciation later on.
Yeah, and they will undoubtedly have lots of appreciation because I think what you put out there in terms of like your willingness to be empathetic and that your dedication to their success, and especially in the case of SUA or Soka University, their happiness. But it's going to come back, and yeah, as teachers, we always have to look at the long term perspective. That it could be a year, could be 10 years. I don't know. It's no expectation on that. But I think that one phrase that comes to mind is that and maybe you've heard this before, but teachers, like we teach the way that we have been taught, because a lot of learning can come in the form of like modeled behavior and how we're like as students observing constantly the people around us and making kind of decisions as far as like what is appropriate behavior, and yeah, how do I want to kind of relate with other people around me? So my question is, you've had many teachers in your life, teachers, professors, and is there any one particular teacher that stands out as a particularly empathetic teacher that demonstrated to you why it's so important, and it's a teacher that you really appreciated? And also, would that same teacher be considered a global citizen?
Hmm. That's I feel like I've been lucky in some ways that I've had a lot of teachers who have been like I've had a few bad teachers over the years, but nothing like totally crazy. And I feel like I've had a lot of really good teachers and also like mentors out of the classroom. In the fraternity, we had kind of guys who I would model after who were maybe graduated. One of my friends, he had his PhD before anybody, and I lived with him for a little bit, and now he's like, this high government official in Oklahoma, like the Board of Education. And another guy is like a professor at Western Carolina University. And so like modeling not just the teacher, but the mentorship aspect of like, that's just a person I want to be like. Like that's kind of what I'm thinking. If we're just thinking of like from like the classroom setting, or not even from the classroom setting, but again, like somebody like one of my old teachers, Gita Steiner Comsi at Teachers College, like she could be like a tough grader and like harsh feedback and like this kind of thing. Like it's like you better raise your game if you're going to be in her classroom. But if she saw something in you and she like could see that you were like really pushing and trying, like she would push herself. And like later on, like she helped me get this podcast that I do. And she, years later, like, oh, you remember you did this podcast and you interviewed me, when you were a student. So now like years later here, I'm gonna, connect you back. And so it's just one of those things of like somebody like that of, okay, they remembered, they remembered that you worked hard and that you tried hard as a student. And so that can kind of, appreciate. And if, are these people global citizens? When you didn't ask me this question today, but sometimes I do struggle with like what that means. And I'm curious, like what people always tell you, because it's sort of like, I am always reevaluating it in my own mind as well. And yet, like, I kind of sort of say like, it's just like, is this just like an appreciation for a bunch of differences around the world? Or is it actually like, I need to absorb and be like these other things? Like how can that be? Is there an aspect of like, is it just elite Western society that produces globalization or sorry, of a global citizenship, or is there something else? And so I always struggle with that because I don't want to just be that last one, that's kind of where I struggle with that sometimes.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for sharing about all these really important figures in your life. Like the mentorship component is crucial, and I love how, what in the case of your former classmates as well as with, professors, there's this sense of kind of striving together, and recognizing that, kind of the earnestness that you put into a project like the podcasting, and then seeing someone respond, that someone that you respect,
Hmm.
kind of rise to the occasion, find that hidden gear, and then, accelerate even further, I think is a very important sign that you found a really genuine, educator. And I think that's so crucial. And then, I kind of what you shared about just your own kind of like thoughts about global citizenship. I mean, it also must be tough as well, given the fact that at Soka University, the mission statement is kind of everywhere, and it's all about fostering global citizens. And so then, thinking about what that means, and then I appreciate how you're trying to constantly like build upon that, or, kind of be critical of it, but in a sense of like, because of how important that is and how that has really captured the minds and the hearts of a lot of people, a lot of students at this university. And yeah, and I agree that it is definitely not for the more kind of like neoliberal
Hmm.
cutthroat competition. Let's just have them be like super citizens and they just get all the best jobs and everything will be great for them. And it's only coming from one, small section of the populace. I think that, and if it were to me, for me to kind of share a little bit,
Yeah.
it does come from the, I guess you could say, Soka tradition, or more specifically, the founder of Soka University of America, Daisaku Ikeda,
Hmm.
who has been very clear that, you know, being a global citizen does not necessarily have to be anything fancy and glitzy. It is not necessarily all of those like shimmering lights in South Korea that we were talking about, and the like, wow, you get to experience all of this, right? But it can actually be something quite ordinary. And I think that yes, there's this deep sense of like knowing that as humans, as a species, an organism, like that has life, that we are interconnected. But I think it's much deeper than even that. And it's this understanding that we have this, I don't know. It's like, as a human being, like we're all grappling to like understand why we're here, and we're trying to experience something, beyond ourselves, right? Not just kind of limiting it to our own kind of experience, but recognizing that like our actions have ripple effects. And I think those who truly understand the weight of their words and their actions, and it comes from a conviction, let's say, that they want the world to be a better place as a result of building that connection, building that kind of community, rising to the occasion, like what your professor did for you, in all kind of spheres, in whatever their capacity is, that yeah, they don't even have to have had like left the country to have truly made that kind of like impact on someone who maybe will go on to make an even bigger change, than they could have anticipated. But that's kind of like, in a few words, where I would come at this from. But I know that, there's probably even more that can be said. But yeah, and perhaps this is something that you've already had in conversation with other people,
Sure.
either at SUA.
We
But
definitely grapple with it in class. I give we have some different weeks where we sort of look at different readings and definitions, and I'm still a social scientist at heart, so like looking at ways to measure it, because that's always like an
mm,
argument. But what you're talking about is so philosophical that it's almost like I don't think we actually can measure it, and maybe the fact
mm,
that we're trying to is part of my hangup, of just of understanding it, because those things are unmeasurables in some ways,
yeah,
especially if you're trying to, especially in measurement, then you got to compare. It's like that makes it even more fraught, I think.
yeah, no, I agree. I think, yeah, I don't have an answer to that in terms of like, are we able to measure it? Because again, this notion of the global citizen has been likened to just being a good human being, right? Who's just concerned about the world. But I mean, but again, it's like you can't quite quantify that in terms of like,
Hmm.
oh, it's because you've done this number of like good deeds, or you said this, you made this many like, friends in this way. So it is a bit fraught in terms of understanding like the measuring, like you said. But I think nonetheless, it does provide. I think my hope as we talk about this more is to kind of build a sense of like a shared language, right? Common language, as well as a common aspiration towards striving in that direction, and that ultimately people recognize that it's valuable to be able to like see oneself in an expansive way, but also that like by being connected to others is not kind of a weight that you carry, but actually something that's tapping into another, aspect of what it means to to be alive, right? In this current moment. Um, but yeah, did you have any follow-up comment about that or?
I mean, I think I just feel bad if because people are tuning in expecting like us to provide answers, and they're like, our answer is we don't know. Sorry, listeners. Maybe you have to keep listening to the next episode to find out if the Scott can come up with the answer.
Well, I mean, I appreciate that, and thank you. Again, shout out to the listeners. One of the interesting things about this podcast, because I've had conversations with a number of people, and it's similar to what you said. Or you said that you're interested to hear what other people have to say
Mm,
because perhaps their understanding is different. And I guess like I'm trying to listen to what's similar in a lot of the different kind of stories that are brought up and the kind of, again, grappling of like, well, what do I really mean? And maybe it's not such a great idea to think of oneself as a global citizen, and that's okay as well. I think it's just this kind of new frontier, if you will, and that boxing it in with a definitive answer at this point may seem a little bit premature. But I think the fact that you've been able to contribute with your stories is already phenomenal, and I really appreciate you for that. And yeah, stay tuned for the next episode because we gotta keep talking about this. It's important.
right.
So as we're wrapping up with our conversation, and yeah, we're kind of coming close to the time, but I wanted to ask a final question, and that's about any kind of like book or movie recommendations you might have based on our conversation.
Sure. I mean, the what you were talking about, just like talking about the measurement and how we do it too, is like it really hit me that like, oh, we're talking about The Good Place. So if you haven't seen that show, I know it's sort of like NBC pop culture or whatever, but if you wanted to pull the trigger on a show, they're all out right now. They deal with a lot of this stuff on the show. It's you know, don't read any spoilers. Just go and watch the show and the Good Place. So that connects to, I think, some of this sort of morality and things like that. But I also wanted to give one that was like closer to me. And again, it's a TV show, I suppose, but I think it went under the radar a little bit. And I had just recently finished it after its run. But Reservation Dogs. It's about a coming of age story. On this Native American tribe in Oklahoma, filmed in Muskogee, Oklahoma. This past summer, I just went and visited some of the sites that it was filmed at, and it's really like just like nothing else on TV, I think, or that's been on TV, following these little Native American kids as they kind of make their way through the world. And it's sort of, there's spirituality and mythology and sort of philosophy that's related to Native Americans. And you can see a lot of the culture in Oklahoma that I kind of grew up with, even though I'm not Native American, which they kind of get into that too, kind of the relationship between white people in Oklahoma. It's just like it really hit home, and I think people would, if you enjoy this conversation and you enjoy finding and seeing new tiny microcosms of places and with great performances, you'll like the show.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ryan. I appreciate those recommendations. And yeah, they sound super relevant. One, a little bit more. Would you say The Good Place is lighthearted? Or kind of,
Definitely,
okay,
definitely,
yeah.
yeah,
And then
yeah, yeah.
Reservation Dogs, yeah, definitely like that. I'm very
Have you
keen to.
seen it? Have you seen both of them?
I've heard of the title. I haven't actually watched it, but
Okay.
now I feel even more compelled to because, right, recommendation coming
It's
from
a quick
from
it's a quick 3 seasons. You can run through it pretty easily.
awesome. Well, thank you so much, Ryan. I've truly enjoyed this conversation, learned a lot about you, and appreciate kind of tussling with this notion of what does it mean to be a global citizen, especially towards this end part. But you've left us with a lot of food for thought, and I appreciate you taking the time. And I wanted to give the last word to you. Any final thoughts, or just a sign off to the listeners?
Just thanks for having me. This has been fun. Hopefully, it we answered some questions and maybe gave more.